Listen carefully. What I'm about to tell you is not meant for casual ears. It is knowledge wrapped in blood, sealed in the glass jar of a university archive, and guarded by silence. In a basement corridor at Cornell, suspended in yellowed formaldehyde, there floats a human brain. It does not look like much, just a mass of ridged flesh, pale, preserved, lifeless. But for decades, men who dared to measure it called it one of the largest, most brilliant ever recorded. Its owner spoke in 8 tongues, could translate Greek with the ease of a scholar priest, and claimed he had unlocked the hidden architecture of language itself, the very code of human thought. Yet with this same brilliance, this same mind, he murdered women, children, and strangers with a coldness that still shakes history. His name was Edward Howard Rulloff. To the world of 19th century America, he was 2 men at once, a genius philosopher and a calculating killer. But let me ask you, how can genius and savagery live in the same skull? What is brilliance worth if it feeds on blood? You see, men like Rulloff are not accidents. They are mirrors of the very system we inhabit. A society that rewards masks, that elevates intellect without testing morality, that gives power to the cunning predator cloaked in refinement. Rulloff was not just a man, he was a warning. A glimpse into the darker contract between knowledge and power. Imagine it, a scholar whose every lecture dazzled his audience, whose every gesture convinced entire towns he was their savior, their healer, their mentor. And yet, behind closed doors, that same refined figure crushed skulls, poisoned kin, and plotted new lives under new names. He was not just deceiving his victims, he was training us to see what we still refuse to see today. That evil rarely looks like evil. It looks like genius. It looks like authority. It looks like the man who claims to know better than you. Tonight, I will take you down the path of Edward Rulloff's double life, the brilliance that charmed a nation, and the blood that paved his way. But know this, once you see the pattern, once you recognize the face of corruption in its finest suit, you will never again look at intellect, authority, or respectability the same way. You will understand why the deadliest predator is always the one who convinces you he is your teacher. The story begins not with brilliance, but with ashes. Long before he was celebrated as a scholar, Rulloff's shadow was already taking form in the fires he set as a boy. Born around 1819 in New Brunswick, he was a child marked by hunger, not just for food, but for knowledge, for control, for the intoxicating feeling of outwitting those around him. Neighbors remembered a boy who devoured books, with the same appetite he later had for domination. But his mind was never innocent. Even as a teenager, suspicion trailed him like smoke. Dry goods shops mysteriously burned to the ground, and Rulloff, then still John Edward Rulloffson, was always nearby, his pockets a little fuller, his eyes a little too calm as the flames consumed what he could not simply steal. When caught, he did not break down, did not tremble like other boys exposed in crime. He studied. Prison was not punishment, it was education. In those cells, he sharpened himself, learning the value of disguise, of planning, of wearing respectability like armor. And when he stepped across the border into the United States, he was no longer the petty thief, no longer the reckless arsonist. He had shed that skin. He emerged as Edward Rulloff, scholar, teacher, healer, a predator polished into something his prey would not recognize until it was too late. Understand this. The mask of brilliance is the oldest weapon of predators. Institutions love men like Rulloff because they look like proof that intellect is virtue. But intellect without conscience is not virtue. It is a knife. And in his hands, it would become a scalpel, slicing through the illusions of small towns, desperate for culture, for refinement, for a savior who could make them feel important in the eyes of the world. Rulloff understood something most men never learn, that society does not actually test the soul of its geniuses. It worships them. It gives them power, position, daughters, trust. and never looks beneath the surface. And so when he arrived in Dryden, New York, at just 23 years old, tall, distinguished, with dark eyes that seemed to hold worlds of knowledge, the people received him like a gift from Providence. They invited him into their schools, their homes, their families. He had them in his hand from the very first word. But brilliance is not light. Brilliance, without the weight of conscience, is simply another form of shadow, one that blinds those too eager to see only its glow. And in Dryden, that shadow was about to swallow everything. Picture Dryden in the 1840s, a small village rising with the hum of the Erie Canal, a place where farmers traded harvests and families whispered about progress, religion, and education. In that quiet landscape, knowledge was currency, and the man who carried it walked like a king. Edward Rulloff, tall, polished, with hair combed neatly back and clothing always precise, moved among them like an emissary from another world. His voice carried the weight of culture, his words dripped with philosophy, his memory held entire passages of Latin, Greek, and German poetry. The townsfolk had never seen a man like him, and in their hunger for wisdom, they mistook his intellect for moral authority. That is how predators move, by offering what people crave. And Rulloff offered more than words. He lectured on phrenology, the fashionable pseudoscience that promised to read character from the contours of a skull. To men and women of the frontier, this was alchemy, a doorway into the secrets of the soul. Crowds gathered to watch his demonstrations, marveling at the way he seemed to peel back the mask of human nature with a single touch. They saw enlightenment. What they did not see was the darker truth. He was studying them, weighing weaknesses, learning how to wear the perfect disguise. But even predators need more than reputation. They need an anchor, a possession to prove they belong. For Rulloff, that anchor was Harriet Shutt. She was 17, refined, admired, the daughter of one of Dryden's most respected families. Tall, luminous, with hazel eyes that laughed easily, she embodied everything he did not have: status, acceptance, purity. And to a man like Rulloff, purity was not something to cherish. It was something to consume. The attraction was immediate. But beneath the charm, the ground was already poisoned. Rulloff's charisma wrapped Harriet in stories of a larger world, tales of European scholarship, whispered promises of destiny beyond the narrow fences of rural life. For a young woman raised in a world of restraint, those stories were intoxicating. Yet even in these early days, the mask slipped. His temper, sharp, sudden, violent, emerged whenever other men looked her way. His jealousy was not love, but ownership. And ownership, for a man like Rulloff, was always a prelude to destruction. Still, the Shutt family saw his learning, his refinement, his aura of genius, and they looked away. They excused the outbursts. They convinced themselves their daughter had found a husband of rare brilliance. What they had really welcomed into their home was a storm. And soon, that storm would shatter everything they thought was safe. It was the last night of 1843. Snow fell heavy across the hills of central New York, covering the farms and villages in white silence. Inside the Shutt family home, firelight flickered against polished wood as neighbors gathered to witness what should have been a union of promise. Edward Rulloff, the learned scholar, was marrying Harriet Shutt, the farmer's daughter, whose grace matched his intellect, or so everyone believed. The ceremony carried the air of destiny, the merging of brilliance with beauty, refinement with stability. Guests whispered that Dryden had never seen such a pairing, but masks always crack at the edges. During the vows, Harriet's hand trembled ever so slightly in Rulloff's. Some saw nerves. Others, perhaps, sensed something darker. And then came the moment of rupture. The minister, following custom, congratulated the bride with a gentle kiss on the cheek, a harmless gesture of blessing. In that instant, Rulloff's face twisted. His eyes flared with a jealous rage so raw, so violent, that guests recoiled in silence. The room felt colder. The fire seemed to dim, as if the air itself understood what the people tried to ignore. Here was the true Edward Rulloff, a man whose brilliance was inseparable from a hunger to dominate, to own, to destroy anything that threatened his control. And yet, what did the family do? They smoothed it over. They whispered excuses, wedding day nerves, stress, exhaustion. Harriet herself tried to believe it, tried to rewrite the look in his eyes as passion rather than violence. But once you've seen the predator, you cannot unsee him. His fury that night was a prophecy. The honeymoon did not save them. Within weeks, the patterns hardened. Tender devotion one moment, volcanic rage the next. Jealousy turned every innocent glance, every conversation, into an imagined betrayal. And when Harriet's family tried to step in, Rulloff's solution was calculated: isolation. He convinced her to leave Dryden and move with him to the nearby village of Lansing, cutting her from the protective circle of her kin. To the community, it looked like a new couple seeking independence. In truth, it was the tightening of a noose. There, in Lansing, he played the healer and the scholar, filling his home with books and cures, dazzling neighbors with his knowledge. But behind those walls, Harriet lived in a cage, her world reduced to the moods of a man whose genius masked a growing storm. The marriage was not a sanctuary. It was a crucible, and the fire was only beginning to rise. In Lansing, Edward Rulloff played his greatest role yet. He was no longer just the charming lecturer or ambitious schoolmaster. Here, he reinvented himself as a physician, a man of healing, a man of science, a man the community could trust with their lives. Using his knowledge of botany and herbal medicine, he treated farmers, mothers, children, all with a calm authority that inspired confidence. To the people of Lansing, he seemed almost miraculous, a doctor who charged modest fees, spoke with refinement, and carried himself with the weight of European scholarship. His home reflected the illusion. Books crowded every table, thick volumes on languages, philosophy, natural science. He spoke endlessly of a great work he was preparing, a theory of human language that, he promised, would one day change the way mankind understood itself. Guests who visited left impressed, almost humbled, by the intensity of his studies. They whispered that Lansing had never hosted a man of such brilliance, that perhaps they were living beside a mind destined for immortality. But Harriet knew another reality. Behind the walls, the same intelligence that dazzled neighbors became a weapon of suspicion. Every glance she exchanged in public, every word spoken to another man, returned home as an accusation. His temper came like a lightning strike, sudden, violent, terrifying. She lived under the constant shadow of being judged, measured, and punished by a man who saw betrayal in the air itself. Then came the deaths. Harriet's sister-in-law, weakened after childbirth, turned to Rulloff for treatment. He prepared his herbal remedies with solemn care, administering them with the confidence of a physician certain of his skill. Within days, both mother and infant were dead. Tragedy, people said, nature's cruelty. But whispers began. Rulloff's reaction was too cold, too detached. Instead of grief, he muttered ominous comments, speaking of who might go next, as though he were already choosing the order of the grave. The Shutt family, once uneasy but hopeful, now began to harden in suspicion. Yet they could not prove anything. And this was Rulloff's power, to cloak himself in intellect so thoroughly that even murder could be explained away as misfortune, coincidence, fate. He stood above their doubts, an untouchable figure of knowledge, while in truth, he was feeding on the very trust they had given him. Every death, every argument, every flash of rage was leading to the inevitable. The mask was thinning, the storm inside him building, and soon his genius and his violence would collide in an act so brutal that even history could not look away. June 22nd, 1845. The sky over Cayuga Lake churned with thunderclouds, the summer air heavy, oppressive, electric with storm. In Lansing, inside a modest house filled with books and whispers of genius, a different storm had already begun to rage. Edward Rulloff stood before his wife Harriet, his mind fractured by jealousy, his voice sharpened into accusation. To neighbors, he was still the scholar, the physician, the man who lifted their small town into the light of culture. But within these walls, he was something else entirely. A predator cornered by his own delusions. The argument was not new. It had played out countless times, each cycle growing sharper, more dangerous. He demanded they leave for Ohio, where his supposed brilliance would be recognized by universities that were surely waiting for him. She refused. Her family had just buried her sister-in-law and infant niece, and grief tied her firmly to Dryden's soil. To Rulloff, her resistance was not loyalty to family. It was betrayal, evidence of conspiracy, proof that others were turning her against him. His paranoia devoured reason. On the kitchen table lay a mortar and pestle, iron and heavy, used only moments before by Harriet to grind peppercorns. As lightning flashed through the window, she tried once again to calm him, to resist his wild demands. But laughter, her small, weary laugh at his absurd accusations, ignited the powder keg. In that instant, something in him broke. He seized the pestle, and with the full force of his rage, brought it down upon her skull. The sound was sickening, final. Harriet collapsed, blood pooling across the floorboards, her life extinguished in the instant her husband chose ownership over love. Rulloff did not cry out, did not stagger back in horror. He stood calm, watching, as though the act itself had been an equation solved. His genius had found its conclusion, control achieved through annihilation. But then, the cry of an infant. From the cradle their daughter Priscilla wailed, disturbed by the violence, her small voice cutting through the storm outside. And in that sound, Rulloff heard not innocence, not blood of his blood, but a witness. A future mouth that could speak against him. The predator's calculation returned. He moved deliberately toward his child, his mind cold and precise. The storm rattled the windows, thunder drowned the night, but inside that house, a silence fell soon after. The silence of a man who believed himself cleansed of obstacles. That night, Lansing lost more than Harriet and her child. It lost the illusion that brilliance protects against evil. And though the village did not yet know, a shadow had been born that would haunt New York for decades to come. The morning after Harriet's screams had been swallowed by thunder, a disturbing calm hung over the village. Neighbors passed Rulloff on the road and saw no grief in his face, no trace of panic. He spoke politely, even smiled faintly, as though nothing had fractured inside his home the night before. But within days, questions began to spread. Where was Harriet? Where was the baby? At first, Rulloff offered explanations with the same poise he used in his lectures. Harriet, he said, had gone to visit family. The child, naturally, was with her. His tone carried authority, his words measured, and for many, that was enough. After all, this was Edward Rulloff, the scholar, the healer, the man of refinement. Who would doubt him? In the 19th century, women vanished often, consumed by illness, carried away by relatives, lost to the quiet tragedies of rural life. Rulloff leaned on that reality, weaving absence into invisibility. But Harriet's family did not believe him. They pressed, demanded answers, confronted the man who now stood between them and the daughter they knew would never abandon them willingly. Behind closed doors, whispers sharpened into accusations. Harriet was dead, the baby gone with her. But accusations without proof dissolve into air. No body was ever found, no evidence surfaced, and so the suspicion became a ghost that haunted every gathering, every conversation, but could not convict. Here lies one of the darkest truths of power. The absence of evidence becomes the shield of the predator. Rulloff had learned how to erase, how to bury, how to silence. He turned the very fragility of rural law enforcement into his cloak. For all their doubts, for all their fears, the community could not touch him. And so he remained, teaching, healing, dazzling, moving forward, as though Harriet and Priscilla had never existed at all. Imagine the arrogance of that survival. To stand among people who looked at you with suspicion burning behind their eyes, and to answer it with more brilliance, more lectures, more displays of cultured superiority. He did not shrink into guilt. He expanded into it. His crimes became fuel for his intellect, proof that he was above ordinary morality, that his genius had freed him from consequence. And in this way, Edward Rulloff stepped into the next stage of his life. Not hunted, not punished, but transformed. The double life was no longer hidden, it was perfected. He had proven to himself, and to those who dared whisper his guilt, that brilliance could kill and still walk free. By the late 1840s, Edward Rulloff had mastered the art of erasure. Harriet and Priscilla had vanished, their names unspoken in polite company, their absence sealed beneath the weight of his authority. He had outlived suspicion by drowning it in brilliance, convincing the world that genius could not possibly share a roof with brutality. And in doing so, he stepped deeper into the double life that would both exalt and destroy him. In Lansing and beyond, his reputation grew. Farmers came for advice, not just about illness, but about crops, politics, philosophy. He was the learned man in a world starving for learning, the voice that gave small-town America a glimpse of sophistication. Prominent families invited him to dinners, where he recited Greek poetry and dismantled arguments with surgical precision. He lectured on the mysteries of language, filling the air with words that few could follow, but all admired. To question him was to question progress itself. But brilliance, when untethered from conscience, always hungers for more. Rulloff was no longer satisfied with admiration. He wanted recognition on a larger stage. Universities, journals, history itself. He spoke often of a grand linguistic theory he was developing, a system that, he claimed, would reveal the hidden structure of all languages, perhaps even the origins of thought itself. Neighbors who visited his home saw him bent over manuscripts, ink-stained fingers scratching into the night, as though possessed by revelations beyond mortal grasp. They whispered that he was destined to stand among the great minds of his age. Yet beneath this pursuit of immortality lay the same predator who had silenced Harriet. He lived by theft as much as by intellect, Books, instruments, money, all found their way into his possession by means his neighbors dared not scrutinize. When challenged, his fury returned, sharp and venomous, his eyes burning with the same jealous violence that had ended his wife's life. Those who crossed him learned quickly to step aside. Here lies the paradox that chills us still. Society will forgive anything: suspicion, violence, even whispers of murder, if a man dresses it in genius. The townspeople wanted Rulloff to be their beacon, their proof that even in rural America, brilliance could bloom. And so they looked away, again and again, while the storm inside him only deepened. This was not a man escaping his past. This was a man refining his mask, perfecting the art of walking among the living with blood already on his hands. And the more he was celebrated, the more dangerous he became. By the 1850s, the name Edward Rulloff carried both awe and unease. He was the self-made scholar who spoke of language as though it were the key to creation itself. He claimed his magnum opus, thousands of pages of dense theory, would one day prove that all tongues descended from a single root, a revelation that would lift him into the company of Aristotle and Humboldt. He called it the philosophy of language, but the work never seemed finished. Drafts multiplied, revisions expanded, and whole chapters disappeared into trunks and boxes. Visitors found his rooms stacked with manuscripts, loose papers spilling across chairs and tables, ink scrawled in margins, like the rantings of a prophet. His brilliance was undeniable, but so was the growing sense of obsession, of a man devouring himself in the pursuit of immortality, and obsession needs fuel. Books were expensive, instruments costly, the leisure to write purchased by money he did not have. Rulloff turned increasingly to theft. He prowled the villages around Cayuga Lake, breaking into homes, taking what he needed: gold watches, cash, medicine, fine clothing. Always with the same justification: these were not crimes but necessities. He was sacrificing the small morality of property for the great morality of discovery. If the world only knew what he was preparing, they would forgive every transgression. But the law does not bow so easily to genius. In 1846, suspicion hardened into evidence. Authorities accused Rulloff of poisoning Harriet's family, charges that carried the weight of murder. He was arrested, locked away, his manuscripts confiscated, his reputation dragged into the open. For the first time, the mask seemed ready to fall. Yet even in prison, Rulloff wielded intellect like a weapon. He wrote petitions, argued legal principles, confounded judges with his command of language. Witnesses faltered, evidence slipped, and the case against him withered in the shadow of his courtroom brilliance. He emerged not exonerated, but untouchable, released back into the world, carrying the legend of a man too clever to be condemned. Still, cracks widened. His thefts grew bolder, his temper sharper, his eyes darker. To some, he was still the misunderstood genius, a mind chained by the ignorance of his age. To others, he was a predator slipping beyond control, a man who used knowledge not to enlighten, but to excuse. And beneath it all, the ghosts of Harriet and Priscilla lingered. No body had ever been found. No grave had ever been dug. The whispers persisted, an undercurrent that no amount of scholarship could silence. Rulloff had built his empire on absence, and absence has a way of returning. By the late 1850s, Edward Rulloff was no longer just a scholar drifting between manuscripts and petty thefts. He had become something more dangerous, a teacher of crime. His intellect, once aimed at languages and philosophy, now bent itself toward the mechanics of burglary, deception, and survival in the shadows. He began gathering a circle of young men around him, impressionable, restless, dazzled by the brilliance of a man who quoted Virgil while planning a midnight break-in. To them, Rulloff was not just a leader, but a prophet, proving that crime could be elevated into an art if guided by intelligence. Where others saw theft as desperation, he framed it as strategy, a necessary sacrifice to fund a work that would outlast them all. His manuscripts, he insisted, could not be completed without their help. Every burglary was for science, every coin stolen an investment in eternity. The group moved like phantoms through upstate New York, breaking into homes, shops, warehouses. Watches disappeared, medicine chests emptied, cash vanished into Rulloff's pockets. And always, his voice smoothed over their doubts. Men of genius must live above the law. If society will not provide for us, we must take what we require. It was philosophy weaponized into justification, intellect twisted into seduction. But genius breeds arrogance, and arrogance invites risk. The gang began to target larger halls, mercantile stores, supply depots, places guarded not just by locks, but by men with guns. Each success emboldened them. Each escape convinced Rulloff of his invincibility. To his followers, he was half mentor, half tyrant, demanding loyalty, punishing hesitation with words sharp enough to scar. Yet beneath the thrill of theft lurked rot. The young men who followed him were not scholars. They were boys chasing shadows of brilliance, dragged into crimes far beyond their understanding. Some whispered doubts, others wanted out, but leaving Rulloff was never simple. He had a way of binding people to him, of turning their fears into obedience. Just as he had once isolated Harriet, he now ensnared these men, making them believe their fates were tied to his, and so the stage darkened. Edward Rulloff was no longer simply the jealous husband or the eccentric scholar. He was becoming something larger, the architect of a criminal fraternity, a man who corrupted youth with the promise of knowledge and destiny. His crimes were no longer the outbursts of a violent temper, but the organized steps of a man convinced he was building a legacy worth killing for, the shadow of his past. Harriet, Priscilla, the unspoken graves, had not vanished. It was simply joined now by others, younger voices pulled into the silence of his orbit. And history, watching, knew where this would lead, to blood, to betrayal, to the hangman's rope waiting at the end of his genius. It was the summer of 1870 when Edward Rulloff's grand design of intellect, theft, and arrogance collided with destiny. He and his young disciples, his so-called pupils, had spent years prowling the towns of central New York. But this time, the prize was larger. A dry goods store in Binghamton, heavy with merchandise and money. To the boys, it was a heist for profit. To Rulloff, it was a necessary raid, a step toward finishing the manuscript that, he insisted, would change the history of human thought. They entered the store under cover of night, tools clinking in their sacks, adrenaline coursing. Rulloff the elder, the mastermind, directed each move with the same precision he once used to diagram sentences. A crowbar here, a lantern there, a whisper to keep watch. For a while it seemed the burglary would proceed as planned, but the silence of night betrayed them. A watchman, alerted by the faint glow of lamplight behind the store's shutters, approached. His name was Frederick Merrick, a man whose duty was to protect property, but whose presence, in that moment, threatened to unravel everything. Rulloff's disciples panicked. The plan, the order, the philosophy, all of it trembled on the edge of collapse, and then, the fatal choice. The watchman confronted them, and chaos erupted. In the dark, in the scramble of bodies and shouts, a pistol cracked. Merrick fell, struck dead. Blood spread across the floorboards of the shop, mingling with spilled merchandise, the night now heavy with the scent of gunpowder and iron. Rulloff did not pull the trigger himself. Yet his fingerprints lay all over the moment. He had taught these boys to think of theft as destiny, to see violence as necessity, to follow his genius wherever it led. The philosophy had spoken through them, and now a man was dead. The disciples fled into the night, hunted by lawmen. Panic dissolved the gang into fragments, some captured, others scattered. Rulloff, too, was taken, dragged in chains, no longer the scholar of Cayuga Lake, but the architect of murder in Binghamton. The trial would come swiftly, the evidence undeniable, and the gallows already waited in the imagination of the public. But Rulloff's greatest performance was yet to come. For even as the shadow of the noose fell across him, he sharpened his rhetoric, turned his brilliance into theater, and prepared to transform his own execution into a spectacle that would sear his name into history. The courthouse in Binghamton filled like a theater in the spring of 1871. Farmers, merchants, students, ministers, all pressed into the gallery, eager to witness the spectacle of Edward H. Rulloff on trial for murder. For decades, whispers had followed him. Harriet's disappearance, the vanished child, the burglaries that seemed too precise to be chance. Now the man who once lectured on the origin of language stood chained, accused of orchestrating the death of Frederick Merrick, the watchman whose blood stained the floor of a dry goods store. But if the public came expecting a broken man, they were mistaken. Rulloff did not shrink in his chains. He rose. His voice, deep and deliberate, filled the chamber. His arguments, sharpened by years of study, sliced through witnesses and evidence alike. He quoted legal precedent, dissected testimony, and at times seemed to rival the very lawyers meant to prosecute him. It was as though the courtroom were his lecture hall, and the assembled crowd his unwilling students. To some, it was terrifying, the way he could twist fact into doubt, the way he could dress violence in the robes of intellect. To others, it was exhilarating. Here was a condemned man defying the machinery of justice, with nothing but his mind. Newspapers called him the learned murderer, a phrase that carried both horror and fascination, yet the evidence was unshakable. Merrick was dead. The gang had confessed. Rulloff's role as leader, instigator, corrupter of youth could not be denied. The jury deliberated only briefly before delivering the verdict. Guilty. Still, Rulloff fought. He appealed, wrote petitions, thundered against what he called the ignorance of society. He declared himself a martyr to genius, a man punished not for crime, but for the audacity of intellect. Even as his appeals crumbled, he polished his rhetoric, preparing not for freedom, but for legacy. For Rulloff understood something chilling. If he could not escape the hangman's rope, he could at least control the narrative that wrapped around his neck. His trial was never about innocence. It was about immortality. And as the date of his execution approached, he leaned fully into the role he had always believed was his. Teacher, philosopher, mind above men, the noose would silence his body. But his voice, he intended, would echo. The sentence was death. Edward Rulloff would hang, yet the weeks between verdict and execution did not resemble the silence of a condemned man. They resembled the preparation of a lecturer before his final address. Prison guards expected despair, maybe confession. Instead, they found him calm, articulate, and almost eager, welcoming newspapermen, philosophers, and curious visitors who crowded the jail in Binghamton to look upon the infamous learned murderer. What they encountered unsettled them. Behind the bars was no frothing lunatic, no broken soul awaiting judgment. There sat a man with sharp eyes, still filled with fire, still speaking of the grand system of language he had nearly completed. He insisted that humanity was on the edge of a revelation, that his work would expose the very root of thought. If only, he told them, he had more time, more paper, more years. Instead, society, in its ignorance, would destroy him, robbing the world of its greatest discovery. Some were entranced. Reporters left their interviews torn between revulsion and awe, their columns dripping with both. They quoted his words as if they were scripture. A genius like me comes once in centuries. You may kill the man, but you cannot kill the truth I have uncovered. Others saw the manipulation for what it was, a last performance, a desperate attempt to frame himself not as a criminal, but as a martyr sacrificed on the altar of justice. Still, fascination grew. Pamphlets circulated, printing fragments of his supposed linguistic theories. Students debated him in taverns. Ministers denounced him from pulpits, warning that intellect without morality led only to damnation. The people of New York found themselves caught between fear and curiosity, drawn to Rulloff as moths to a flame. In his cell, he wrote ceaselessly, letters, petitions, fragments of his book. His handwriting filled page after page, as though the act of writing itself could hold back death. He told anyone who listened that his mind was too valuable to waste, that the state should preserve him, study him, let him continue his work even in confinement. But the law had spoken. No theory, no manuscript, no final flourish of eloquence could undo the bullet that had ended Frederick Merrick's life, and so the world waited. Crowds gathered in Binghamton, taverns buzzed with gossip, newspapers sold out their editions. Edward H. Rulloff, scholar, murderer, fraud, genius, would soon mount the scaffold. And as the clock ticked down, one question lingered in every mind. What would such a man say in the very last moments of his life? On May 18, 1871, the town of Binghamton awoke with a morbid hunger. Word spread quickly through the valley. Today, Edward H. Rulloff would hang. By dawn, the streets were crowded. Farmers left their fields. Clerks shuttered their shops. Mothers carried children on their hips, all pressing toward the jail yard where a scaffold had been erected against the gray sky. It was less an execution than a spectacle. Vendors hawked peanuts and cider. Newspapers sent special correspondents. Preachers mingled uneasily among the crowd, warning that they gathered not for justice, but for entertainment. Yet the people could not turn away. For decades, Rulloff's name had carried mystery, murder, vanishing women, whispered genius. Now they would see him silenced. At noon, the prison doors creaked open. Rulloff emerged, tall, composed, his dark eyes scanning the sea of faces. He did not shuffle like a broken man. He walked with deliberate steps, chin raised, as though he were ascending not to death, but to a lectern. Chains rattled at his ankles. Still, he radiated command. The sheriff read the sentence. The crowd hushed, and then at last came the words they had waited for, Rulloff's final speech. He spoke with clarity, with the practiced cadence of a man who had spent his life wielding language as both scalpel and shield. He declared himself innocent of Merrick's murder, though not of theft. He condemned society for its blindness, for crushing genius beneath the heel of law. He insisted that his manuscript, unfinished, yet profound, would have altered the course of human understanding. The state, he thundered, was executing not just a man, but a mind that could have given them eternity. Some in the crowd wept, others scoffed, but all listened. In that moment, Edward Rulloff achieved what he had always desired: attention, reverence, the gaze of the world fixed upon him. The hangman adjusted the noose. Rulloff, unflinching, placed it around his own neck. His last words cut through the stillness. I die a martyr to the cause of truth. The trapdoor dropped. The body jerked, shuddered, fell still. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by silence. Then, as though released from a spell, the people began to murmur, to disperse, carrying with them the memory of a man who had blurred the line between brilliance and monstrosity. The scaffold was dismantled. The crowd went home. And Edward Rulloff, scholar, criminal, murderer, genius, entered history, not through the pages of his great manuscript, but through the dark fascination he left behind. When the scaffold boards were carted away and the gallows dismantled, Edward H. Rulloff's body was laid to rest in obscurity. Yet death did not silence the fascination. In some ways, it amplified it. For decades, whispers and stories trailed his name like smoke after a fire. The manuscript, the fabled solution to language, was never found in any complete form. Fragments surfaced in his papers, dense with speculation, unreadable to most, and unfinished. Scholars debated whether he had ever truly been close to a breakthrough, or whether his claims were the delusions of a brilliant but unstable mind. Perhaps it had always been smoke and mirrors, a scaffolding of ideas never destined to become a cathedral. Or perhaps, as some argued, the world really had destroyed something extraordinary when the hangman's trap fell. The people of New York remembered him with unease. For some, he was proof of the dangers of intellect unmoored from morality, a mind too clever to be chained, too ruthless to be trusted. For others, he lingered as a Gothic curiosity, a reminder that genius and monstrosity are not opposites, but neighbors, sharing the same dark street of human possibility. In the decades after, criminologists studied him. Writers turned him into folklore. Mark Twain himself once remarked that Rulloff had the most prodigious brain of any criminal ever, noting that when weighed after death, it was larger than any on record in America. Science tried to measure his intellect in ounces and grams, as if a scale could hold the contradictions of his life. But perhaps the true weight of Rulloff lay elsewhere, in the silence where Harriet and her child had vanished, in the young men he corrupted, in the watchman's body on the shop floor. His legacy was not the book he dreamed of, but the trail of ruin he left behind. Edward Rulloff's story endures not because of what he gave the world, but because of what he took from it. He remains suspended in history's imagination, half scholar, half murderer, a man who proved that brilliance without conscience becomes a blade sharpened against humanity itself. And so he lingers, not as the author of the great book he promised, but as a cautionary tale, the genius who might have changed the world and instead chose to destroy it.